All right then guys, on to the base. So he faces, here's his footprint, so forward is this part here. So what I'm going to do is I've got three colours on my palette: whole brown, red brown, mud brown and dark green. So I've put them on the palette and I've watered them down quite a bit. And all we're going to try and do here is literally slap this paint on. Right, and we're going to spread it around and just try and wet blend it in with the other colours. And what we'll get is this sort of cool amalgamation of colours that will work really nicely. And like we did on the model, we can use that opportunity just to use it as all of our base coats. So we're not going to then go and do too many. We might do a couple here, but I want to sort of use this so we can actually use these colours just as the base coats on these other objects. And what we'll end up finding then is that we can get, just like we underpainted the model, we can get the same sort of effect on this base. Okay guys, so there's the base all wet blended. So the first thing I'm going to tackle is the stony bits here. So I've put dark green and I've also got blue grey as my highlighting colour here. So I'm going to go with pure dark green first of all. This normally comes out lighter than it actually looks. And I'm using my very old mixing brush here, because we're just going to try to thin this paint down a little bit, and I'm just going to sort of stipple the colour on it just to keep a sort of textury look to this stonework. And as you can see, we're just going to build up these light tones and try and keep a sort of texture. It's going to be sort of stipply and blocky, and hopefully we'll get it to look a bit sort of like stone. Hopefully. But we've also got to remember our light source, like I say, is from above. And we can use that to sort of, like the pieces underneath and stuff, we're probably not going to do too much to, because they're going to be in shadow. And this is sort of quite a dark, grim sort of scene anyway. It's not going to be like overly lit. Okay guys, so we've got the first layer on the stonework. It looks quite nice. So I've added some more of some of the blue grey in to get a lighter tone now. And it's still quite thin. And we're still using this crappy old brush. And this time we just want to try and push to some highlight areas on the edges and stuff, to try and give some areas of interest on the stone. And again, we're just going to go all over. I'm not going to cover this completely in this tone, just more like I'm trying to push the light here towards this upper corner. Sorry about that guys, my dog's getting excited. And I'll finish the rest off camera. And for the last highlight here, I've just added even more of that blue-grey. And this, we're just going to be picking out some very sharp edges. We can. As I said, it's really, this is where you can maximize the use of your brushes, because you can save. I sort of recycle my brushes. I move them down into, when the point goes, I move it into like a base coating brush, and then when it goes beyond that, it becomes a mixing brush, and so forth. And I eventually get to brushes where they're really, no good for painting anything detailed, but for things like this, I can still use them, and they're really handy still. And you don't want to be using your, finest Kolinsky sable for doing sort of rough stippling like this, because it will just ruin them. So recycle your brushes and get more use out of them. Right, so to add some more interest to this, I've gone back to the colours I used for the wet blending, and I've just thrown together the green and the brown, which is this really sort of dirty sort of brown colour, and I'm going to sort of glaze and stipple that in the darker areas. Again, just trying to add some interest to this stonework. Adds a bit more contrast. And again, with a lot of this, we can just stipple it on, and we can glaze it as well. So we're just adding that little extra bit of depth in the colour work. And I'll do the rest of that off camera. Okay, so next up for us is going to be these iron or steel gates. So we're going to paint them in a sort of very rough NMM. And I've mixed together grey, blue and dark brown, which is a colour we've used on the base. And I'm just going to very roughly just pick these out, because we're not going to go, these are not going to be beautiful shiny NMM, we just want these to look rough. And we're going to have sort of just some odd highlights on them. And we'll do some glazing at the end. By doing these very loose, hopefully we'll keep them integrated into the base. Right, to add some highlights to this, I've added in the blue-grey, the very light grey that we used earlier on the stone. And what I'm going to do is just pick out a few little areas here now. There's some little highlights. Don't go overboard here. We don't want it to be like really cool shiny silver. We just want a couple of spots here that we can see as highlighted areas. Right, for the final highlight, I've just got the pure blue-grey now. And this is just, we just want to be adding little dots now to things. And this will just give it that little effect of some little shiny spots. Although we're going to rough it up a bit in a minute with some glazes. But for now, we just want this really sort of almost chaotic rough look. Right, so to finish this off, I'm going to go back to the glazing mix I used on the concrete columns, which is that dark brown and green, but I've also mixed up a very dark brown, which is the actual dark brown that we used earlier, with a little bit of black in it, just for some variation. And what we're going to look for is where a lot of where these metal railings are actually touching the ground, or where they're intersecting with the base. We want to really sort of try and integrate them in. So as you can see, I've got the brown mix now. And again, we're just dabbing it in certain places. There's nothing really uniform about this. It's just hope for the best. And you're just dabbing it on in areas and trying to make some sort of patterns. Well, not making patterns really, just very random. And just keep switching between the two so that these colours will mix as well. And we'll get hopefully a very blotchy looking railings. Right, and the last touch for these railings is that we're going to add a little bit of rust. So I've got deep brown and light rust here. And we've got quite a nice sort of orangey colour here that we're just going to try on this very thin, just to get a little bit in some of these joint areas. You know, where all this metalwork intersects is where we probably get these rust patches. And where pieces are laying on the ground, we might get a bit more. It's just adding in a little variation of weathering and colour, which will just make it look a little bit more interesting, I think. And the last touch is we're going to go with the pure light rust now. And this, we just want this in a couple of little tiny spots, just to add a little bright bit in those rust areas. But we use this very sparingly. Okay, so we're going to paint some of all these loose vines and bits on the floor just to try and pick those out. I'm using the dark green that I had on the palette earlier, and I've just added mud brown to this. And these, I've thinned this down quite a bit because we just want to sort of roughly just sort of paint a mid-tone highlight on these. We don't want these to be overly done, you know what I mean? These are one of those elements. When you're basing, elements like this need to be there, but they shouldn't take up too much of the viewer's attention. They're almost like support actors, right? They're there, they're necessary, but if you go over highlighting them and making them too colourful and bright and saturated, they're going to take over. So we just want to give them a little tiny bit of attention. But like I say, we're just really painting them in as the details, but we don't want them to take over. Okay, and probably the last highlight on these, because like I said, we're not going to go mad with these. I've just added even more of the mud brown in, and we literally just want a few little highlights in a couple of places. But like I said, nothing major. Just a bit more sort of definition in a couple of places. But that's really all we're looking for. Right, so I'm going to start preparing to do the tree now, and I really like the colour we've just painted there, so I'm going to take those colours we've just used. I'm going to sort of try and wet blend these up. Paint's very thin, but I really like that greenish tone. I want to sort of work these colours into this tree. And like I say, this paint is very thin, as you can probably see. But what we're going to do, we're just giving it a bit more of an interesting tone. And just like a dirty brown. So there's probably a couple of spots I need to just tidy up with some water, but we can just spread that paint around, and it will just blend into the base. It'll be fine. It will help integrate the tree into the surroundings actually. That's pretty cool. Okay then guys, so I've mixed in a lot more of the mud brown now into a little bit of that dark green. And we're going to work on just highlighting parts of this tree. Now, one of the things I'm going to do here, I'm not going to put too much emphasis on it because it's at the back of the scene, back of the base. It's not really going to show a lot. So I'm just going to try and do some small general highlights, a bit of colouring of it. But we're not going to go too overboard because, like I said, this is it would be quite a dark scene anyway. You know, probably at night, and it's definitely at the back of the base. So I don't want it to be all bright and lovely like on a bright summer's day. This needs to look old, almost like it's in a graveyard, you know, an old creepy decrepit tree. So we don't want this to be, you know, hyper bright and shiny with lots of bright highlights. Okay, so I've now got pure mud brown, and we're just going to add a few little highlights to this tree, just in a few places. Alright then guys, for the final highlight on the tree, I've added in some pistachio, which I already had on the palette. And we just really want to put just a couple of little tiny highlights on here. And I use pistachio because it's a greeny yellow. So it's got that green tinge to it. And I want to keep some of that green in this tree. But we just really only want a few little highlights here and there. And these highlights, I'm really concentrating into the forward-facing part of the base. I'm really not thinking about the reverse view here. I'm just thinking about the focal point. So the last element on the base is going to be these, the couple of little skulls and bones that we've got on there. Excuse me. And I've added buff to my palette, which is going to be my main highlighting colour here. And I've used a mix of the colour I used earlier, which was mud brown, a little bit of the dark green, and then I've added buff to that. So we're trying to keep this sort of greeny brown tone consistent throughout all these elements if we can. And we're just going to give this some very basic highlighting. These parts really not going to be seen too much, because they're sort of going to be covered by him a lot of the time. But we can certainly give them some detail work and a little bit of emphasis, so they're at least readers' skulls and bones when people see them. But I'm not going to go, like I said, with so many things on this base, I'm not going to go crazy with these in terms of lots of detail, because it's really, some things are just, they're probably never going to be seen, some of these things. By the time I get him on there, on the base, he's going to cover a lot of things, and a lot of these elements are going to be very much in the background or hidden. So sometimes like this, we just want to give them the basic colour of the object. In this case is bone. Recording. Right, so we've just added more buff now to the mix. And again, I'm just going to give these some very small basic highlights, which, these would be skulls and things that are trodden into the ground. They're not all going to be polished up to look lovely and shiny and clean. So we've got to sort of respect the environment we're in, but we also want to give enough highlight so that we can create definition. That's all we're looking for. And if we do it this way, we keep our paints nice and thin, and we can just do some very nice smooth blended layers. And then we don't have to do too much work to incorporate them into the base. And that's pretty much it. That's all we're going to need. Okay, so the last steps in this base, because the actual flooring is a little bit bland, I don't want to make it too exciting, because it's not an exciting area. It's got to be bland and dark. So I might do some highlighting yet, but I've made a mix here of the dark greeny brown, and I've added some black to darken it up. And we're just going to go around some of the features especially and try and add some little sort of definition and shadow colours to certain areas. And we're especially looking for areas where there's a little groove in the ground. Like here, for instance, there's a groove around these vines. And then inside here. And all this is going to do, it's just going to create a little bit more interest in this groundwork, some interest rather. We don't want to overdo it, otherwise it'll all just get lost. So you've got to be selective with these areas. That's what will give it some contrast and some definition. And we may do an all-over highlight in a second, but I'm not sure until I've finished this layer. I'm going to see how this looks first. Recording. Right, for the last layer, I have decided to give a little bit of a a highlight in a few places, and we're going to stipple glaze some of the light brown mix we had earlier. So this is sort of mud brown and a little bit of the dark green mix we had. And I just want to stipple very thin paint over a few areas. We're just trying to just make some areas just stand out a little bit more. And give them some little highlight areas. And we can just keep going over areas and build it up. It's very thin, this paint, so it's not going to do a lot of difference the first layer, but a bit like other glazing, we're just going to build it up bit by bit so we get a little bit more opacity where we want it. And because we're stippling, we're not really getting any sort of brush strokes here. So we're just getting lots of little dots and splodges everywhere that sort of fit in well with a base or a textured surface. Right, and there we have it, guys. There is the finished Ghoul King. He's been put on his base, and I think it integrates really nicely with his colour scheme and the pretty dead tree at the back there. Overall, I think I'm very pleased with how he's came out, and yeah, the base works really nice for me. Thanks for watching, guys, and hopefully see you next time for another Brushmaster video.